Before she died, Loretta Lynn carried with her more than just the crown of country music. She carried secrets, rivalries, and unspoken truths about the women who shared her stage, and sometimes her spotlight. Among them was Tanya Tucker, a prodigy who burst into Nashville as a teenager, fearless and unapologetic, threatening to rewrite the rules that Loretta herself had fought to establish. For decades, their names were spoken together, two icons, two generations, circling each other in the unforgiving arena of country music. On the surface, it was respect, admiration. But beneath the rhinestones and stage lights, questions lingered. Were they allies or adversaries? Did Loretta see Tanya as a successor or as a threat? But what did Loretta Lynn really confess before her death? And why does it still echo through Nashville today? In the smoky glow of Nashville's Grand Ole Opry stage, Loretta Lynn was already royalty. By the early 1970s, she had climbed from Kentucky's coal country to the throne of country music. Her voice was unmistakable, piercing, heartfelt, and unafraid. She sang about women's lives with a brutal honesty no one else dared, and that fearlessness had crowned her queen in a kingdom where few women lasted. Loretta had seen countless hopefuls rise, sparkle briefly, and fade before the spotlight consumed them. But the night she first laid eyes on Tanya Tucker, something shifted. For the first time in years, Loretta felt uneasy. Tanya wasn't like the others. Barely 13, she carried herself with the swagger of a hardened outlaw. Her breakout single, Delta Dawn, was already climbing the charts, a haunting tale of heartbreak that no child should understand. Yet when Tanya sang, the crowd froze. Her voice was raw, ragged with emotion, eerily mature. Watching from the wings, Loretta's stomach tightened. This wasn't a manufactured child star. This was danger. Backstage, Tanya was nerves and grit wrapped in denim and fire. Surrounded by handlers and record men, she still managed to command attention. When she spotted Loretta, her wide eyes lit up. To Tanya, this was royalty made flesh, the woman who had written the very blueprint she was trying to follow. "Miss Lynn," she whispered, "I just want to be like you." Loretta smiled graciously, but inside a storm brewed. She remembered her own teenage start, the long nights on the road, the exploitation, the men in suits who tried to mold her. Loretta had fought them off, carved her path, and built her empire on defiance. Now she wondered, was Tanya another pawn in Nashville's cruel game, or a real threat to her crown? The press wasted no time. Headlines compared Tanya to Loretta, dubbing her the next queen of country. Publicly, Loretta wished her well. Privately, she admitted to friends, "That little girl's voice is too old for her age. It's like she's been here before, and that scares me." Yet beneath the suspicion was recognition. Loretta saw herself in Tanya, the hunger, the fight, the refusal to be silenced. Tanya was no passing star. She was real. She was destined. Loretta couldn't know then that Tanya Tucker would shadow her career for decades, their bond blurring the line between rivalry and respect. But on that first night, Loretta Lynn felt the uneasy weight of a crown that suddenly didn't feel so secure. Trust was not something Loretta Lynn handed out easily. She had clawed her way up from the Kentucky hollers into the bright lights of Nashville, battling a world ruled by men who thought women belonged in the background. She had been underestimated, patronized, manipulated, and she carried the scars to prove it. Every triumph had been earned through grit, and Loretta knew that in country music, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. So when Tanya Tucker burst onto the scene in the early 1970s, Loretta's first instinct wasn't admiration. It was suspicion. Tanya was unlike any young woman Loretta had ever encountered. Most female country singers were polished and carefully restrained, their images sculpted to charm wholesome audiences. Tanya didn't fit that mold. Barely a teenager, she was raw, reckless, and unpredictable, with a defiant streak impossible to ignore. Loretta saw danger in that recklessness. Was Tanya being pushed too hard by managers eager to profit? Or was she deliberately feeding the fire herself? Whispers spread quickly in Nashville. Tanya was said to be difficult, stubborn, even openly defiant toward the men who controlled her career. To Loretta, this was a glaring warning sign. She had survived Nashville by being shrewd, knowing when to fight and when to compromise. Tanya, on the other hand, seemed to have no filter, no strategy. To Loretta, it was like watching someone strike a match in a room soaked with gasoline. Then there was the matter of image. Loretta had built her empire on authenticity. The coal miner's daughter, a woman who embodied resilience and family values. Tanya, by contrast, was being packaged as country music's rebel child. Her voice was hauntingly mature, singing of heartbreak, lust, and loss, emotions well beyond her years. Critics called her a prodigy. Fans marveled at her depth. But Loretta wasn't impressed. She was unsettled. "What kind of childhood did she have?" Loretta asked once, "to sing like that?" What stung even more was the way Nashville's power brokers treated Tanya. Loretta had fought tooth and nail to open doors slammed in her face. Yet those same doors seemed to swing wide for Tanya. Men who once dismissed Loretta now bent over backwards for this teenage sensation. Loretta never admitted it aloud, but it hurt. Still, buried beneath the mistrust was a quiet envy. Tanya was bold in ways Loretta had never dared. She stormed forward without fear, reckless and fearless. Loretta didn't trust it, but she couldn't look away either. To Loretty Lynn, Tanya Tucker was both marvel and menace, too young, too talented, and far too reckless to trust. To the outside world, Loretty Lynn and Tanya Tucker were just two country stars whose paths occasionally crossed. There were no screaming matches, no scandalous interviews, no headlines declaring war between them. On stage and in public, they smiled, applauded, and spoke politely of each other. But beneath those polished facades, a quiet, unspoken rivalry simmered, one that only the insiders of Nashville truly understood. Loretta was the queen, the woman who had clawed her way out of coal country to sit atop the throne of country music. Tanya was the prodigy, a teenage rebel whose raw talent and swagger threatened to overshadow the very women who came before her. Their tension wasn't loud or theatrical. It lived in fleeting glances, in whispers backstage, in smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Industry insiders saw it often. At award shows, Loretta would clap for Tanya's performances, her hands steady, but her face tight with restraint. Tanya, for her part, looked at Loretta with both admiration and defiance, as though she longed for approval but refused to beg for it. Nashville executives and journalists only added fuel to the fire, casting Tanya as the future and Loretta as the past. It was a narrative engineered to spark competition, and it worked. What fans didn't know was that both women carried grudges. Loretta felt slighted by how quickly Nashville elevated Tanya, as though her own years of struggle and barrier breaking had been forgotten the moment a teenager stormed the charts. Tanya, meanwhile, bristled at being labeled Loretta's successor rather than her equal. She didn't want to be the next Loretty Lynn. She wanted to be Tanya Tucker, loud, untamed, and unapologetic. Their rivalry bled into the music. Loretta had been the one to scandalize Nashville with songs about birth control and cheating husbands. But now, it was Tanya making headlines for her bold lyrics and rebellious persona. To Loretta, it felt as though Tanya had taken her blueprint and stamped her own name across it. And yet, beneath it all, there was a bond neither admitted. Loretta saw in Tanya a mirror of her younger self, a woman unwilling to bow to tradition. Tanya saw in Loretta proof that survival was possible, that a woman could endure Nashville's cruelty and still rule. To the public, they were simply stars orbiting the same stage. But to those who knew better, their relationship was a quiet duel. A clash of queens whose rivalry defined both their legacies in ways the world never fully realized. Behind the glitter of rhinestones and the bright lights of the Opry, Nashville was a city built on whispers. Deals were struck in dimly lit bars, alliances formed in backstage corridors, and betrayals often carried more weight than any hit record. For Loretty Lynn and Tanya Tucker, the rumors that swirled around them didn't just fuel tabloids, they cut deep into their already fragile relationship. Loretta had always believed in loyalty. Coming from the hollers of Kentucky, she built her career on honesty, humility, and the strength of family. She expected that same loyalty from the people around her. But Tanya Tucker? Tanya was a wild card. She wasn't bound by the same rules, and she wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers if it meant getting ahead. And Nashville noticed. The whispers began with producers and promoters. Tanya's going after Loretta's spot, some said. Others claimed Tanya had undercut Loretta for tour slots, pushing for headliner status when she hadn't yet paid her dues. The whispers found their way back to Loretta, who bristled at the idea that a teenager was maneuvering to take her crown. It wasn't just disrespect, it was betrayal. At the same time, Tanya had her own suspicions. In private, she told friends that Loretta wasn't as supportive as she appeared on stage. Tanya believed Loretta used her influence to hold her back, keeping her from certain opportunities out of jealousy. Whether the rumors were true or not, Tanya felt them in her bones. Nashville thrived on competition, and everyone wanted to see two queens at war. The tension reached a boiling point during a recording session rumor that spread like wildfire. Word was that Tanya had been offered a song originally intended for Loretta, a track that insiders swore could have been another coal miner's daughter. Loretta allegedly heard the news and flew into a rage, accusing Nashville's power players of trying to erase her legacy in favor of a younger face. Tanya, for her part, denied ever knowing the song was tied to Loretta, but by then, the damage was done. From that moment on, the relationship was poisoned by suspicion. Loretta couldn't shake the feeling that Tanya was circling her throne, and Tanya believed Loretta saw her as nothing more than a threat. Every smile at award shows, every handshake backstage, carried the weight of unspoken betrayal. But Nashville thrived on such stories. To executives, the rivalry wasn't a problem. It was publicity. Pitting two women against each other sold records, filled newspapers, and kept fans talking. The men who ran the industry knew exactly what they were doing. They whispered in Tanya's ear about replacing Loretta, then turned to Loretta with tales of Tanya's ambitions. In the end, neither woman realized just how manipulated they were. For years, fans only saw the polished surface. But behind the scenes, Loretta and Tanya's bond was fraying, slowly eroded by gossip, jealousy, and betrayal. And Nashville, hungry for drama, was only too happy to feed the fire. In country music, the media was both a kingmaker and a destroyer. A glowing profile could make a singer a legend overnight. A single headline could shatter a career. Loretty Lynn knew this better than most. Her rise had been built not only on her songs, but on the story of the coal miner's daughter, a narrative the press used to crown her as the symbol of American grit. But when Tanya Tucker burst onto the scene, the media frenzy was louder, wilder, and far more dangerous. And soon, their two stories collided. The contrast was irresistible. Loretta was the queen, the self-made woman who fought her way to the top with dignity and stubborn resilience. Tanya was the teenage firebrand, a prodigy with a voice that seemed older than her years. The storyline wrote itself: tradition versus rebellion, past versus future, queen versus princess. The press milked it for every drop of drama. Headlines screamed comparisons. Is Tanya the next Loretta? Can Loretta survive Tanya's rise? Loretta despised it. She felt decades of work were being reduced to a question mark about whether she was still relevant. Tanya, meanwhile, bristled at being called the next Loretta. She didn't want to live in someone else's shadow. She wanted to be Tanya Tucker, loud, untamed, and unforgettable. But the press wasn't satisfied with comparisons. They wanted conflict. Every interview became a trap. If Loretta praised Tanya, it was spun as condescension. If Tanya expressed admiration, it was twisted into mockery. Innocent words became headlines, and headlines became rumors. Soon, gossip columns invented entire feuds, that Loretta had banned Tanya from backstage, or that Tanya mocked Loretta's old-fashioned ways. None of it was confirmed, but in Nashville, rumor carried more weight than truth. Fans began to pick sides. Letters poured into magazines, debating who deserved the crown. For Loretta, the circus was exhausting. She had always let her music speak for itself. For Tanya, the attention was intoxicating but dangerous. Every sensational headline cemented her as country's wild child, making it harder for her to be respected as a serious artist. The truth was simpler and sadder. Both women were pawns in the same game. The media knew that stories of rivalry between women sold better than brotherhood between men. By the late 70s, they had succeeded. Loretta and Tanya were etched into the public imagination not as peers, but as adversaries, locked in a feud for the ages, whether or not it really existed. Despite the rumors, the whispers, and the headlines, Loretty Lynn and Tanya Tucker were still human beings. Two women navigating an industry that often thrived on tearing them apart. And while the world believed they were locked in a constant battle, what few people knew was that, in private, Loretta and Tanya did talk. And those conversations revealed a truth far more complicated than rivalry. The first real breakthrough came one night after an awards show in the late 70s. Both women had been performing, both were exhausted, and both ended up in the same green room away from the flashing cameras. Loretta, sipping her tea, looked at Tanya and said quietly, "They sure love putting us against each other, don't they?" Tanya, barely 20 at the time but already hardened by years of pressure, shot back, "Yeah, but it ain't them singing the songs, is it?" It was the beginning of a rare honesty. Loretta admitted she felt threatened by Tanya's rise, not because she disliked her, but because she knew how Nashville worked. "They'll crown you today and forget you tomorrow," she warned. Tanya, defiant but vulnerable, confessed that she never wanted to replace Loretta. She just wanted to be taken seriously. For a fleeting moment, the walls between them crumbled. Over the years, more such conversations followed. At festivals, backstage at the Opry, even during quiet phone calls when the pressures of fame became too much. Tanya would call Loretta for advice, and Loretta, despite her suspicions, would listen. "Don't let them take your voice," she told Tanya once. "Don't let them tell your story for you." It was advice Loretta had lived by, and though she wasn't sure Tanya always heard it, she gave it anyway. But these private exchanges also carried pain. Tanya once admitted to Loretta that she envied her stability, her sense of home and family. "I never had that," Tanya confessed. Loretta, who had built her life around her husband and children even while touring the world, realized then that Tanya's wildness wasn't just rebellion. It was survival. Though they never broadcasted these talks, they shaped the way both women saw each other. To the world, they remained rivals. To each other, they became something else entirely. A strange mix of adversaries and confidants, bound not by competition, but by shared scars. It was in these quiet conversations that the foundation of their eventual understanding was laid. They weren't friends, not exactly, but they weren't enemies either. They were two women standing on the same battlefield, fighting the same war, even if the world insisted on telling it as a duel between them. By the mid-1980s, country music had changed. The outlaw era had passed, the pop country wave was rolling in, and younger voices were flooding the charts. Yet Loretty Lynn and Tanya Tucker, two women from different generations, were still standing. What surprised Nashville most wasn't that they survived, but that their relationship shifted in a way no one expected. The bitter rivalry began to soften, and respect crept in where resentment once lived. Loretty had endured. She was still the coal miner's daughter, still touring, still filling theaters with fans who had followed her since the 60s. Tanya, meanwhile, was rebuilding. After her wild child image began to overshadow her talent, she fought to reinvent herself, not as the teenage sensation anymore, but as a woman with grit in her voice and pain in her songs. And through it all, Loretty watched. One night in particular marked a turning point. It was at a charity concert in Nashville, where Loretty and Tanya were both scheduled to perform. The organizers, perhaps mischievously, slotted them back to back. Loretty went first, singing her classics, songs about marriage, heartbreak, and survival. The crowd roared, as always. But when Tanya walked on stage afterward, something unexpected happened. She didn't try to outshine Loretty. Instead, she dedicated her first song to her. "This one's for Loretty Lynn," Tanya said into the microphone. "She paved the road I get to walk on." The gesture stunned the audience, and Loretty herself. For the first time, Loretty saw Tanya not as a rival, but as a woman who respected her legacy. After the show, Loretty approached Tanya backstage and simply said, "That meant a lot, honey." It was a small moment, but it opened a door neither of them had walked through before. From then on, their interactions changed. Tanya began to call Loretty not just for advice, but for encouragement. Loretty, who had once bristled at Tanya's rise, started praising her in interviews, calling her one of the strongest voices of our time. The media, always hungry for drama, didn't know what to do with the shift. They wanted feuds, not friendships. But Loretty and Tanya were carving their own narrative. Part of this newfound respect came from shared struggles. Both women had battled through scandals, heartbreaks, and industry politics. Tanya had survived near-career-ending controversies. Loretty had endured the loss of her husband, Dew, whose health was failing by the late 80s. They each understood what it meant to keep singing when life threatened to silence them. And while they were never the kind of friends who shopped together or traded recipes, there was an unspoken bond between them now. When they crossed paths at award shows, there were no icy stares, only nods of acknowledgement, sometimes even warm hugs. Tanya once admitted privately to a friend, "Loretty could have hated me forever, but she didn't. That's strength I'll never forget." By the time the 90s rolled around, fans noticed the change too. Loretty and Tanya were no longer painted as rivals in the press. They were icons, standing side by side as proof that women in country music could endure every storm and still hold their crowns. As the years wore on, Loretty Lynn's voice carried more than music. It carried memory, regret, and reflection. By the time she reached her twilight years, she wasn't just the coal miner's daughter. She was a living legend, a storyteller whose truth mattered more than ever. And in one of her last candid conversations, Loretta finally opened up about Tanya Tucker in a way that shocked those who had known the old rivalry. It happened during a sit-down interview at her Tennessee ranch, long after she had slowed down from touring. The interviewer asked about the women she admired most in country music. Loretta listed Dolly, Patsy, Tammy, but then, almost unexpectedly, she added Tanya Tucker's name. "Tanya was something else," Loretta said, her voice soft but steady. "She scared the life out of me when she came up, I'll admit that. I thought she was after my place. But you know what? That girl had more fire than most of us put together. And I love her for it." The interviewer pressed further, asking if Loretta regretted the years of tension between them. Loretta sighed, her eyes misting. "I regret letting other people tell me who Tanya was. Nashville liked to stir the pot, and I let it get to me. Truth is, she wasn't my enemy. She was my sister in this business. If I could go back, I'd tell her that sooner." Those words, simple, heartfelt, were Loretta's final confession about the woman she had once considered a rival. She admitted to carrying jealousy, to feeling threatened, but also to realizing, too late, that Tanya was never the enemy. "We were both just trying to survive," she said, "and Lord knows, we both did." When Tanya heard about Loretta's words later, she reportedly wept. Friends said she replayed the clip over and over, saying, "She finally said it. She finally said it." For Tanya, it wasn't about vindication. It was about closure. The rivalry that had haunted her early career ended not with bitterness, but with a blessing from the very woman she had admired all along. Loretta's confession changed the narrative. Fans who had long believed in their supposed hatred now saw the truth. Their relationship was complicated, yes, but at its core, it was built on mutual respect. Loretta didn't die with grudges in her heart. She died with honesty, and with Tanya Tucker's name among those she considered family. When Loretty Lynn passed in October 2022, the world of country music fell silent. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Dolly Parton, Reba McEntire, Garth Brooks, all calling Loretta the heart of country music. But among the many voices, one tribute stood out: Tanya Tucker's. For Tanya, Loretta's death wasn't just the loss of a colleague. It was personal. It was the closing of a chapter that had defined her entire career. At Loretta's memorial service, Tanya stepped onto the stage, her voice breaking as she began to speak. "She was my hero, my rival, my sister," Tanya said, tears streaming down her face. "And she was the one who showed me that a woman could survive in this business without ever backing down." Then Tanya sang. The song she chose wasn't one of her own. It was Coal Miner's Daughter. Her voice cracked on the high notes, heavy with emotion, but she pushed through, pouring every ounce of love, regret, and admiration into the performance. The audience wept with her, knowing they were witnessing not just a tribute, but a reconciliation that had come full circle. Afterward, Tanya admitted privately that singing that song was the hardest thing she'd ever done. "I felt her with me," she said, "and I finally understood. We weren't rivals. We were two sides of the same story." In the months following Loretta's death, Tanya spoke often about their bond. She told interviewers about the private conversations, the backstage laughter, and even the arguments that made their relationship so real. But more than anything, she repeated one truth: "Loretta gave me permission to be myself. Without her, there'd be no Tanya Tucker." Fans, too, began to see their story differently. The rivalry that once filled headlines was no longer the headline. Instead, it was the respect, the love, and the ultimate reconciliation that defined their legacy together. Tanya carried that legacy forward, honoring Loretta not as an enemy, but as a sister she had lost too soon. In the end, Loretty Lynn and Tanya Tucker's story wasn't about competition. It was about survival, forgiveness, and the way two strong women, pushed apart by the world, found their way back to each other before it was too late. By the time Loretty Lynn drew her final breath in October 2022, she had already secured her place in history. She wasn't just a country singer. She was the voice of rural America, the woman who sang truth to power and never apologized for who she was. But in her final years, as her health faded and her voice grew softer, she left behind one last story, one that involved Tanya Tucker. It was a confession, a reconciliation, and ultimately, a legacy shared between two women who had once been painted as rivals. Loretta's last words about Tanya weren't bitter, nor were they defensive. They were filled with grace. She told her children, her friends, and even interviewers who visited her ranch in those final months, "That girl had fire, and she needed it. I used to think she was coming for my crown. Turns out, she was building her own." With those words, Loretta stripped away the years of headlines, gossip, and whispered rumors, leaving only truth. Tanya wasn't her enemy. She was her peer, her equal, her sister in a world that rarely made space for women. For Tanya Tucker, hearing those words was both healing and heartbreaking. She had spent her youth carrying the weight of being the girl who challenged Loretta. She had lived under comparisons, critiques, and suspicions that she'd never be anything more than a scandal-ridden starlet. Yet, as she stood at Loretta's funeral and sang "Coal Miner's Daughter" through tears, Tanya knew that the story had been rewritten. The feud was gone. What remained was love. What makes this story so haunting is how deeply it speaks to the way women in country music have always been treated. The industry loved to pit them against each other, to turn talent into competition and sisterhood into rivalry. Loretta and Tanya were victims of that system, each manipulated into seeing the other as a threat. But time revealed the truth. Both women were fighting the same battle, carving space in a world that wanted to silence them. Loretta, with her songs about marriage, poverty, and women's rights, gave voice to millions of women who had none. Tanya, with her rebellious spirit and fearless persona, gave permission to the next generation to break molds and ignore expectations. Together, even if they didn't always know it, they expanded the definition of what a woman in country music could be. Loretta's death cemented that legacy. For Tanya, it was more than a personal loss. It was a passing of the torch. She began speaking more openly about Loretta in interviews, not as a rival, but as a mentor. She admitted that she had spent years craving Loretta's approval, and that hearing her final words was the closure she never knew she needed. Fans, too, began to see their story in a new light. The narrative of two women clawing at each other gave way to a more powerful truth: that they had walked parallel roads, carrying the same burdens, and somehow found a way to respect each other in the end. Country music wasn't worse for their rivalry. It was richer for their reconciliation. And so, the final chapter of Loretty Lynn's life included Tanya Tucker, not as an enemy, but as a sister in arms. The bitterness of the past melted into something greater, an understanding that both women had fought for survival, and in doing so, ensured that countless others would have a place in country music after them. Loretta's last words weren't just about Tanya. They were about every woman who ever dared to step into a studio, onto a stage, and into a world that doubted her. Tanya was simply the one who carried that message forward, reminding the world that behind every feud was often just fear, and behind every rivalry, a respect too powerful to be silenced. Loretty Lynn may have left this world, but through Tanya Tucker, her spirit still sings. If the silence lasted for decades, should we accept it as peace? Or ask why it lingered at all? Loretty Lynn's final words about Tanya Tucker carry weight, not just in what she revealed, but in what she chose to withhold. Before memory softens the edges and history turns their story into legend, remember, some truths were never meant to stay buried. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.